In 1975, a government issued an order so psychologically extreme that historians still struggle to classify it as policy or as an act of collective psychiatric violence against an entire civilization. They didn't just seize land, weapons, or money. They seized something far more dangerous: memory itself. Millions of people were ordered to forget their names, their families, their professions, their gods, and to pretend that history had ended and restarted on a single arbitrary date. There was even a name for this forced amnesia. They called it Year Zero. And the architects of this psychological weapon weren't soldiers. They were intellectuals who had studied in Paris and read philosophy books. The most disturbing part? For a brief, terrifying window, it worked. What you are about to discover is not a conspiracy theory. It is documented, studied, and still deeply misunderstood. The Khmer Rouge didn't simply commit atrocities. They engineered a psychological architecture designed to permanently sever a population from its own identity. This story sits at the intersection of history, neuroscience, and mass behavioral control. If you've never questioned how fragile collective memory actually is, you will after this. Subscribe, leave a like, and tell us in the comments: do you think identity can survive forced erasure? Because by the end of this video, your answer might completely change. April 17th, 1975. Phnom Penh, Cambodia. The streets are filled with people waving white flags, believing the war is finally over. Within hours, soldiers in black uniforms begin moving through hospitals, pulling patients from their beds, some still connected to IV drips, and forcing them into the streets. These soldiers carried no identification. They had no visible rank. They referred to themselves only as Angkar, the organization. Nobody knew who was truly in command. That anonymity was not accidental. It was the first psychological weapon deployed. When authority has no face, it cannot be reasoned with, negotiated with, or humanized. It simply exists, absolute and untouchable. 2 million people were expelled from Phnom Penh in 72 hours, the largest forced urban evacuation in modern history. Families who had lived in the same house for 3 generations were told they had 2 hours to leave, and that they would return in 3 days. Most never returned at all. But the physical displacement was only the surface layer of what was being constructed. Something far more calculated was already in motion beneath it. The Khmer Rouge wasn't building a new country. They were systematically demolishing the psychological infrastructure of an entire civilization. And they were doing it with surgical, academic precision. The concept had a name. 2 words that, together, formed one of the most psychologically devastating ideological weapons ever deployed against a civilian population. Year Zero. The official declaration that history, all of it, had just been canceled. Not revised, not rewritten, canceled. As if 2,000 years of Khmer civilization had simply never happened. Money was abolished overnight. Banks were emptied and sealed. Currency became worthless paper within hours of the announcement. But destroying an economy was merely logistical. What the Khmer Rouge attempted next operated on a far deeper neurological level. They systematically dismantled language itself. Certain words were banned. Family titles, mother, father, husband, wife, were replaced with regime-approved collectivist terminology. Citizens were no longer permitted to use the word I. Individual identity, expressed even grammatically, became a punishable act. Psychologists today recognize this technique as identity fragmentation. a method of breaking the cognitive architecture that allows humans to maintain a coherent sense of self across time. Without language anchoring memory, memory begins to dissolve. And without memory, resistance becomes neurologically almost impossible. The architects of Year Zero understood something deeply disturbing about human consciousness, and they were willing to weaponize it against millions of their own people. Here is the detail that most historical accounts bury, and the one that should disturb you most profoundly. The men who engineered Year Zero were not uneducated radicals. Pol Pot had studied in Paris. So had Khieu Samphan, Ieng Sary, and several other key architects of the regime. They had read Rousseau, Marx, and Sartre in the original French. They returned to Cambodia not with wisdom, but with a catastrophically distorted ideology fused to genuine academic intelligence. Psychologists call this phenomenon intellectual detachment, the dangerous capacity of highly educated minds to treat human beings as abstract variables in a theoretical equation. They genuinely believed they were conducting a social experiment that would liberate humanity. That belief made them exponentially more dangerous than simple cruelty ever could. Inside the regime's internal documents, later recovered by researchers, citizens were consistently referred to using agricultural metaphors: seeds to be replanted, fields to be cleared. Dehumanizing language wasn't incidental. It was a deliberate psychological mechanism that allowed educated men to authorize unthinkable decisions without experiencing moral collapse. This is precisely the pattern Stanley Milgram documented in his famous obedience experiments. When authority is framed as ideological necessity, ordinary moral instincts become systematically overridden. But the Khmer Rouge added one layer Milgram never tested. They turned the population into instruments of surveillance against itself. Children were trained to report their own parents, and shockingly, many did. Which forces us toward the most psychologically unbearable question this story contains. There is a psychological threshold, documented in survivors of every major totalitarian regime, where simply remembering who you were before becomes the most radical act available to a human being. Inside the labor camps, Cambodian survivors later described a clandestine practice, whispering the names of their children, their streets, their temples, silently, in the dark, purely to prevent those memories from dissolving. Neuroscience now confirms what those survivors intuitively understood. Memory is not passive storage. It is an active biological process, and without deliberate reinforcement, it degrades with terrifying speed under conditions of extreme stress. The regime understood this. Calendars were confiscated. Clocks became irrelevant. Seasonal agricultural cycles replaced all previous systems of marking time. When you cannot locate yourself in time, your psychological identity begins fragmenting at a neurological level. Not metaphorically, but measurably, clinically, permanently. Researchers studying Cambodian survivors decades later discovered dramatically elevated rates of a condition they termed cultural amnesia, a collective disconnection from pre-trauma identity that transmitted psychologically across generations. Children born after the regime still exhibited identity fragmentation patterns consistent with their parents' trauma, without having experienced the original events themselves. This phenomenon, transgenerational psychological erasure, suggests that the Khmer Rouge's weapon didn't expire when the regime collapsed in 1979. It continued operating silently inside human biology for decades afterward. And here is where this story stops being exclusively about Cambodia and begins being about every society that has ever allowed ideology to override the protection of collective memory. Because the architecture of Year Zero was not unique. Versions of it have appeared across history, across continents, across centuries, always constructed by educated people, always justified by utopian language, and always targeting the same neurological vulnerability: humanity's fragile, precious, irreplaceable connection to its own past. The Khmer Rouge collapsed in 1979, but the psychological damage they engineered didn't disappear with the regime. Survivors spent decades reconstructing fragmented identities from scattered memories, rebuilding interior lives that had been systematically demolished by people who genuinely believed destruction was a form of liberation. The most dangerous ideologies in human history have never announced themselves as evil. They arrive dressed in academic language, utopian promises, and the seductive idea that everything broken about humanity can be fixed, if only the past is erased completely. What Cambodia experienced between 1975 and 1979 was not merely a political atrocity. It was a controlled psychological experiment conducted on 2 million living human beings, and its results are documented, measurable, and deeply relevant to every society operating today. Memory is not nostalgia. Memory is the neurological foundation of identity, resistance, and freedom. When a population loses access to its own history, it loses the cognitive architecture necessary to recognize manipulation and to refuse it. The question this story leaves permanently open is not about Cambodia specifically. It is about the universal human vulnerability that Year Zero so ruthlessly exploited. How much of your own identity is constructed from memories you've never thought to protect? And if those memories were systematically targeted, would you even recognize the attack before it was complete? Think carefully, because throughout history, the people who never asked that question were always the first ones to forget.